Labvakar, dāmas un kungi! Esiet sveicināti šovakar mūsu Eiropas Savienības mājas diskusijā. Šie būs vienīgie vārdi, ko es šovakar teikšu latviski, jo visa diskusija notiks angliski. Tātad es pārslēdzos. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session, this edition of the discussions at the EU House, at the representation of the European Commission in Latvia. And tonight's discussion will be about the debate on cohesion policy 2014-2020 in Latvia. We have a distinguished panel of experts, both local and from abroad. But before we start, I'd like to give the floor to Inna Steinbuka, the representative of the European Commission here, to say a few words.
Thank you, Paul. Dear guests, excellencies, welcome to the European House. I really am privileged to have invited you to participate in this debate. I apologize that I'm staying with my back toward the distinguished panel. And of course, this distinguished panelists, I'm very happy that you have the time, especially Professor Buckler, to come to our European House and to share with you your opinion about cohesion policy in Latvia in the next financial period. I must say that in Latvia, the cohesion policy is always a very hot potatoes because Latvia is staying behind some developed European states, well behind. In addition, in Latvia itself, internally, there is a big disparity between different regions. Latvia is a small country, but the disparity between the eastern part and western part is quite big. If we talk about unemployment, about poverty, then the results are considerably different if we compare our capital city with the region in the eastern part of Latvia. And of course, academic debate about how the cohesion policy should look like in the years ahead and how the cohesion policy should contribute to growth and jobs European-wide, but also in some member states. And I think this is extremely important, especially in the time when the budget for the next financial period has not been adopted yet. However, I think that the debates are approaching their end, and most likely the Parliament will accept something very close to what European Council put on the table. However, it is still not the end of the story, and therefore we can still have exactly European academic debate on this very issue. So I will not take more of your attention because the time is running, and I will return the floor to Paul.
Thank you, Inna, for that. So today's topic, as we know, is cohesion policy in Latvia in the next budget period, and we have a panel here that is very well prepared and informed to talk about it. First of all, our first speaker will be John Buckler, the Professor of European Policy Studies and Director of European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, Great Britain. But afterwards, we'll hear from Pēteris Vilks, who is the head of the Development Planning Division at the Cross-Sectoral Coordination Centre under the Council of Ministers. From Armāns Eberhards, the Deputy State Secretary at the Ministry of Finance, who is responsible for overseeing EU funds, Ministry of Finance, and finally, for a view from the private sector, Andris Strasts, the Senior Economist at Nordea Bank Latvia. But to begin with, Professor Buckler will have a presentation about structural funds. He's one of Europe's leading experts on this question. I was looking at his CV. He's published scores of papers about structural funds, about their analysis and how to evaluate the way they've been used. He is a specialist on the design and implementation of European Union cohesion policy and pre-accession support, on regional economic development and the design, implementation and evaluation of national regional policies in the EU and candidate countries. and about regional restructuring and regional policy in Central and Eastern Europe. So, Professor Bachler, your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Earlier on, when I arrived, Paul was saying that the last conference that he moderated had David Cameron as one of the main speakers, so I've got a hard act to follow, although our views on Europe differ maybe a little bit. As I said, I'm from the University of Strathclyde, from a specialist research institute called the European Policies Research Centre, which does a lot of comparative work, looking across countries, regions, at how regional development, particularly regional development policies, and included within that European cohesion policy works in practice, very much on the ground. And we facilitate a lot of knowledge exchange across between managing authorities and government departments on this subject. In terms of this evening, what I'd like to do is to set up, if you like, a bit of a European context for our discussion on the future of cohesion policy in Latvia. And I'd like to say a few words on first of all, on the budgetary context, because you know, one of the fundamental questions is how much money is going to be available, particularly after the very difficult council negotiations last year in November and then now at the beginning of February, and what the implications for cohesion policy are, and then talk a bit about what is expected in terms of the content of the policy. And I think this is extremely important, because there is potentially a very difficult period ahead for managing authorities and others involved in the implementation of structural and cohesion funds, not just in Latvia, in all member states, because of the Commission's very high expectations for the next period. And I'm picking out three important elements of the regulatory context, and I'll talk a bit about what to us seems to be happening in different European countries with the planning for the next period. Let's start off with the money. Clearly, there was a big. There were very difficult negotiations in February, because for the first time the overall budget in terms of commitments was being brought down. But you can see from the breakdown here, where at the top in light blue there is the heading for competitiveness, which is support for research and innovation, and then dark blue, cohesion, and then lime green, which is sustainable growth. A lot of that is agricultural spending, rural development spending, and then a number of other budget headings. You can still see that much of the budget is still accounted for by the two big areas of expenditure: cohesion policy, structural and cohesion funds, and sustainable growth, which is primarily the common agricultural policy and rural development. So there's a slight decrease in the overall volume of spending, but you can still see how dominated the budget is. Nevertheless, in terms of the change in appropriations from the current period, the current financial perspective period, 2007 to 2013, to the next one, 2014 to 2020, in percentage terms, there's a significant increase in spending on competitiveness, so-called. These headings are somewhat misnamed, because competitiveness is also a very important objective within cohesion policy. But nevertheless, this is, if you like, the important non-regional spending in areas like R&D and innovation. And there's also been some increases in areas like security, citizenship, the global Europe, the EU's aspirations in the wider world. But in percentage terms, cohesion policy and agricultural spending has gone down by between 10 and 13%. Now, what does that mean in terms of cohesion policy? Well, what we have on the screen here is a breakdown of budget headings within cohesion policy by category of region, first of all. You've got on the left-hand side the convergence, or as they're now termed, less developed regions, the cohesion fund, the various categories of transition region. They used to be called, or they are called now, phasing out, phasing in, but in future there is this category called transition, and then regional competitiveness and employment, or more developed regions, and then territorial cooperation. And in the first two columns is the breakdown of spending in the current period. In the next two columns, the European Commission's original proposal, and then in the next two columns, the Council agreement. Now, it's important to emphasize at this stage that the European Parliament still hasn't had its say, and as far as the European Parliament's concerned, too much fuss has been made of the Council conclusions because it is going to make its views felt. The feedback that we get at the moment from the European Parliament is that they are unlikely to influence or to try to change the overall size of the budget, the overall size of the financial perspective, but what they will be looking for within the financial perspective, not just for cohesion policy, for all budget headings, is to be looking for more flexibility in the course of the next period to be able to reallocate funding between budget heading based on sort of underspends and so on. But we've still got to, we still have to find out how the European Parliament is going to influence what is spent in the next period. But it certainly will want to find some ways of making its mark. But anyway, in the final column, you can see the changes in the allocation of different budget heads according to the Council conclusions, essentially away from, in percentage terms, from spending on the poorest countries and regions to more developed parts of the EU. So those are the implications for the cohesion policy budget as it stands. What are the implications for individual countries? I'm not sure how clear that is. What some of my colleagues have done in EPRC is to try and model the very, very complicated formula that the Commission uses for allocating the funding under the cohesion policy heading. Now, these are unofficial calculations, and the member states, I think, are still waiting to hear from the Commission officially what the Commission thinks the allocations are, and there are discussions going on between the Commission and the member states. So these are very much just our estimates. And you can see a wide range of trends or changes from the current period to the next period according to these estimates. For those who've looked at the Council conclusions, these include the Youth Employment Initiative, which make a huge difference for some countries like Ireland, which is at the top of the graphic. According to these calculations, Latvia would go down by about 7 or 8%. I've seen other calculations from other sources which suggest that might be in the right ballpark. But you can see some of the oddities that countries were experiencing huge economic difficulties, like Greece and Spain, losing very significant shares of the cohesion policy budget. And the reason is because of the way that a formula called the Berlin formula, which was originally used in 1999, has been successively modified and in some sense abused during member state negotiations. So we have some very interesting variation. Why should countries like France and the UK be affected to a relatively limited extent according to these calculations? Okay, so that's just to give you a bit of a picture of the money. Let me say something about the content of the policy, or what the Commission anticipates will be the content of the policy, but also what to a certain extent, what the member states through the Council and through the negotiations in various fora have been saying. I think the most important phrase that is used time and time again, and you see it in the Council conclusions from February, is that there is an expectation of improving the quality of spending in the next period under all budget headings. And at meetings under the Cyprus presidency last year and on cohesion policy and previously, this phrase, improving the quality of spending, came up time and time again. Because cohesion policy in particular has been criticized both within the Commission and particularly by the net payer member states, countries like the UK, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands. Cohesion policy has been criticized on account of its poor performance, in inverted commas, or the lack of visibility of, in terms of its achievements. The Commission's proposals for the next period in particular have focused very, very strongly on trying to do something about the performance, to make it very clear that cohesion policy can deliver on European objectives. And there are three elements that I've picked out to emphasize that. The focus on strategic coherence in line with Europe 2020 objectives, a focus on thematic concentration on key EU priorities, and better performance, making the results more visible. And I'll say a few words on each of those points. Firstly, in terms of strategic coherence, the intention is, in the next period, to ensure a more strategic and coordinated approach to using the different EU funding sources. So firstly, the cohesion policy funds, the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund, the Cohesion Fund, but also other funds, rural development, fisheries, Horizon 2020 for R&D and so on. And the idea is that to try and ensure that member states, through the managing authorities, through the implementing bodies, are taking a more strategic approach and are not just implementing the different funding streams in sort of silos, if you like, but are trying to make sure that they support each other and create synergies. And so what we see is member states looking at how institutionally they can make this happen. We can see examples of coordinating committees being created to try and put make the funds work in tandem, or joint managing authorities for different programs, single programs covering all funds, and importantly, simplifying access for applicants to all EU funding. For example, single gateways or portals or application points through which member states can access all funding. There is a phrase that I've heard used called hiding the wiring, which is making, ensuring that all the complexity, the administrative complexity, is sort of hidden from the applicants and the beneficiaries, and making the whole application and implementation process simpler. And part of that is also looking at how eligibility rules can be simplified or harmonized. So the first idea is to get a more strategic, coordinated approach. The second is thematic concentration. And here, the idea is to focus spending on a relatively limited number of objectives. Firstly, to ensure that what cohesion policy does contributes towards the overall objectives of the European Union as expressed in the Europe 2020, and also to avoid the fragmentation of research, the fragmentation of support, and achieve a more critical mass. If we look at what we've learnt in terms of 25 years of spending structural funds and the cohesion fund, what we see is that in many countries, the effectiveness of the funding has been reduced because it's been spread over too many objectives, or it's been spread over too many small projects, unconnected projects, and it hasn't had a critical mass. The result of that is if you're trying to evaluate the funding as we and others have done, it's extraordinarily difficult to identify what is it that structural funds or cohesion policy has actually achieved. So there is in line with Europe 2020 in particular, what we can see in terms of the preparations that are being made in different countries, that there is likely to be significantly more spending on energy-related themes of various kinds, on research, technological development, innovation, and ICT, education, human capital, social inclusion, and health, and continuing a trend that has been underway for the last, I suppose, 10 or 12 years, certainly in this period and the last period. The Commission has been pushing member states away from hard spending on hard infrastructure, particularly as transport, because again, although there are clearly examples where transport infrastructure has been very productive, a fair bit of money has been spent on transport infrastructure which hasn't delivered for various reasons. Now, the way in which the Commission has been going about this is it's been producing a series of it's been producing position papers with its view of how cohesion policy funding should be spent in the next period. And there are 11 thematic priorities that are the key priorities for the next period, and you can see them listed down the left-hand side, from research, technological development and innovation, ICT, small firm competitiveness, low carbon economy, climate change, environmental protection, sustainable transport, and so on, down to institutional capacity. And the Commission has identified for each country in its position papers that it's sent to member states a series of priorities. And in our institute, we've been looking across the priorities. We couldn't get all 27 member states on the slide, plus Croatia. But you can see that in Austria, Denmark, and the UK, we're only talking about 7 priorities, and at the other end, all of the priorities are listed for countries like Latvia. I mean, this is very much, from the Commission's point of view, a starting point for discussion, but it's their perspective on what it is that member states should be spending the money on. And this is what it means by thematic concentration. Lastly, what the Commission is looking for is better performance. And to a certain extent, the themes I was talking about just now, strategic coherence and thematic concentration, they're also intended to ensure better performance. But specifically, an extremely important expectation for the next period is that there will be much more attention given to planning what it is that the interventions will achieve. So they're looking in the programming process, in the programming documents, for much more clearly specified objectives, results, and what it calls an intervention logic. What it is expecting is that when managing authorities and implementing bodies are identifying what it is that they're going to be spending the money on in the next period, that they will be right at the start saying, what is it specifically that we want to have as our outcomes and our results from this spending? And how is it that spending this money will lead to those outcomes and those results? In other words, what's the connection, what's the cause and effect, the causal chain between the inputs, the spending of the money, and the outcomes and results? And also saying, well, how will we be able to measure what those achievements are? How will we know once we've actually got to the point that we want to reach? So this is what it means by the intervention logic. And while it seems perhaps self-evident, in practice it's clearly quite complex. But the intention is that this will support better programming. It will ensure that it'll be easier to monitor what is happening, because there will be fewer but better indicators that will be based on more robust data. And there's quite a lot of work going on to ensure that the data is going to be available. Member state managing authorities working with national statistical offices and so on. And ultimately, it will then be possible to assess achievements, and that we'll have a much better idea 7 years from now what it is that the spending in the next period is actually achieving. And so there's more emphasis on the effectiveness and efficiency of interventions. So we can see that managing authorities are making efforts. The word is there, some efforts, because, well, I'll come to that in a second. What they're trying to do is improve the coherence of program objectives with indicators and targets, using few, as I said, monitoring indicators, and ensuring better comparability across regions and programs. The problem is that looking at where we are now, both from the work that we've done, but also talking to Commission officials in Brussels, there appears to be a major gap between Commission expectations and action at the program level. At an informal meeting of ministers in Cyprus last year, ministers were talking at length about how the quality of expenditure was going to be improved in the next period. But if you look at what many managing authorities have actually been doing in practice in preparation for the next period, there's a disconnect in many parts of Europe between the expectation and what is happening. And many managing authorities, or a fair number of managing authorities, have assumed that they can roll over what they've been doing in this period into the next period with relatively little change. Now, the Commission says they're going to have to think again, but of course this is going to be something for the negotiations. Okay, I'll leave it there. What I've wanted to do, just to kick off the debate, is really just give you some perspective on what the funding situation looks like at the moment, although it's far from complete. How that impacts on cohesion policy, how that impacts in terms of what might flow to member states, and importantly, in terms of the content of the policy, these very important areas of emphasis that the Commission is pushing very hard in preparations for the next period. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Bachler. Very interesting presentation, I think, especially because in Latvia, as I assume in a lot of other places, most of the attention during these negotiations was on the headline figures, how many euros, billions of euros we would be getting, and the fact that the framework in which this money will be received and spent may change as well has not been especially noted by people. Our next speaker will be Pēteris Vilks, who is, as I said, the head of the Development Planning Division in the Cross-Sectoral Coordination Center. Now, that may sound like a very complicated title, but basically, Mr. Vilks was the main person responsible for developing the Latvian Development Plan, which is the framework within which most of this cohesion structural fund money will be spent. Mr. Vilks, if you could tell us, how, first of all, everybody's interested in the headline figure. How do you think that fits with the plans that you were making before the end of the negotiations? And the second of all, how will that money fit in with what we heard from Professor Bachler about how we'll have to be spending this money in the next 7-year period?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Professor Butler, for a very interesting presentation. And I would like to say that Latvia, in some terms, did the homework, because Latvia is prepared for investments in medium-term planning period till 2020. And last year we prepared National Development Plan, which is basic document for next planning period. Of course, we are planning our investments, public investments, not only from Cohesion Fund, but also from state budget and also from municipalities' budget. Cohesion funds is also co-financed by private sector, and altogether money which is put as investments for next planning period in national development plan is 8.23 billion lats, and cohesion policy is only about 1/3 of all this money. National development plan was created based on gap analysis for national development plan, which were preparation of or defining, which were prepared for defining our priorities in Latvia. And for us, of course, basic challenges are related with employment, with poverty, and economic activity. And it resulted with basic goal in National Development Plan, which is economic breakthrough. And three priorities: growth of national economy, human security, and growth for regions. And these priorities are very much related to basic challenges for Latvia in next period. And I would like to underline that basic priority is create economic activity everywhere, in every region in Latvia. Of course, we take very much in account this concentration principle, concentration of resources principle in National Development Plan. And this principle was based on Latvian Sustainable Development Strategy, where 9+21 this cities and region principle was defined for concentrating resources in Latvia. We understand that resources have to be invested with very good allocations of potential investments and potential benefit for all society. But basic principle of the development of national development plan, of course, was objective orientation. And of course, now for us it's a challenge for sometimes transfer our priorities to these thematic objectives which are defined by European Commission. Of course, we are also complying with EU 2020 strategy, but I would like to underline that in sometimes not all fit for us. Because of course we had a little bit different challenges than, for example, for Germany, for Italy, or for Romania. But of course we are looking for next planning period with prepared investment plan. In our national development plan, there are 261 different activities or different investment proposals for investments, where we found that these have to be in benefit for all economy.
Thank you, Mr. Wilks. Our next speaker is Armand Seberhards, the Deputy State Secretary of the Ministry of Finance and responsible for overseeing EU funds. Now, we heard from Professor Bachler that these funds there'll be a demand for greater quality of their use and also more emphasis on what might be called soft topics, human resources and things like that, less on transport. And I know that for Latvia, the transport is an important point. So maybe you could address, first of all, how this new potential framework will influence your work, and what you think about this division that the Commission is proposing.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me start a little bit more with more contextual information, and basically as well in reflection to the professor's statement, what the cohesion policy does for Latvia and was its impact, and then actually gradually moving to the more specificities. First, let me start with outlining that the cohesion policy in Latvia, as well as in other new member states, is instrumental part of the public investments, and basically it forms more than 70% of the overall amount of the public investments in Latvia. does it works? Our calculations at the macroeconomic level show that it works, because before entering the EU, the average from the living standard from the EU general, it was 46 percentage points, whereas at the end of last year it comes to the 62 percentage points from the EU average. And of course, this investment policy is very much the gear of this convergence speed. If we are looking as well to what Professor has been saying on the multi-annual financial framework negotiations and its outcomes, I think perhaps what needs to be reflected as well, that allocation or allocation formula which has been used by the Commission services is so-called linear application of the Berlin mathematical formula, which indeed incorporates a lot of variables. And one of the variables is actually GDP. And the question could be why for some countries and why for Latvia there is a drop, and why for some other countries it's a little bit different outcome. And clearly the result is of this linear application of the formula shows that because of the severe drop of GDP, more than 70.6 percentage points, actually it reflects as well to the overall allocation amount. Whereas for other countries, the drop of GDP was not such severe, or there was even increase. And that is as well reflected into this allocation amount. However, one should say that this severe drop of GDP and a successful outcome of the crisis by the Baltic states and impact of cohesion policy actually as well allow us to argue, and that was as well accepted by our negotiation partners, as well from the northern countries, that the Baltic states and as well in a way Hungary needs to have a little bit different treatment from this general allocation. And basically we were able to convince that the allocation capping, or so-called restriction for allocation, which is as well earmarked as a technical allocation, is being higher for the Baltic states, and as a result of that the allocation amount in this financial perspective is quite similar to the previous one. And clearly, of course, for the scholars it might be an interesting question for the future to analyze whether N90's developed formula is really very effective way of allocation of the funds for the future. But I would gather that that's for the next years to come, as well as analyzing of the impacts and influences of the cohesion policy. If we are moving more closely to the current period and current debate, indeed, we as well as our neighbors are very much awaiting for the particular allocation figures, which would allow us, in particular as well in terms of financial planning, being more pragmatic, more practical in terms of understanding what would be exact investment amount we could really use for practical planning. Why it's important for us at this very stage is that Latvia, with a very strict fiscal policies in mind, as well is calculating very clearly multi-annual budget perspective from the national budget perspective. So that means it goes like part and parcel of the same game, and therefore, as well as you may have heard today in the cabinet, there was a first discussion on the national budget allocation for the next 3 years, and the government in principle agreed on the next steps and as well on the baseline allocations for the budget basis, which forms as well very much the basis for the sound financial management policies for the future. And therefore as well it goes along with a discussion of the possibilities and fiscal space which could be used for further enhancement of the public investments as a drivers for developments for the future. And in this respective, I think the time frame in which we are in, and as Mr. Wilkes said, from the conceptual perspective, we are rather in advanced situation because we have a nationally agreed national development plan, which would enable us as well in going ahead with a practical planning and preparation process for the new financial perspective, in particular addressing the challenges as well as the outlines, as Professor said, from the Commission side, what would be the base for the practical planning and preparation of this investment program. And that means that in parallel, we already have started the negotiations or informal dialogue, as it's called formally, with the Commission services on how to translate the tasks and initiatives from the National Development Plan into the operational programs. Indeed, inevitably, we see some question marks or some situations where we would further negotiate with the Commission services on the right balance of our preparations. And indeed, as you rightly said, if we are looking to the past and as well, Ministry of Finance and as well as the scholarly community have done some estimates of impact of the previous investment, we see that highest return and Riga, Stockholm School of Economics in Riga actually done a recent macro assessment shows that the most highest returns we have investment on roads. Basically, there we have one lat invested gives up to 20-25 lats of return, whereas in other sectors, obviously, it is much less than that. So it's not because of these high returns. We would like to see the importance of public infrastructure and base infrastructure as a priority, but as well that we see that as a part of the investment gap which we see historically built. And clearly, the road infrastructure and basic infrastructure, it's not the end per se. It's means for better connectivity. It's means for implementation of various policies in education and social sphere by which we can really enhance new policy for the creation of new jobs and more as well addressing the regional development issues. So therefore, it's not then just plain, say, addressing in program preparation certain allocations or percentages for RTD or social factor. What we are saying that we have to see that in context, and context of Latvia, context of Latvia's developmental challenges. And that is what we are as well together with line ministries are preparing in program discussions, and that is what we are discussing. More importantly, in addition to what Professor has been saying, there is another element of new element, if you like, in comparison to the previous period. And that is that the programs would be addressed in one common framework, as it called partnership contract. Partnership contract would be signed by the government and by the Commission services and would address the totality of the community co-financed investments. And actually that forms another new challenge for us because previously there has been some coordination between cohesion policy instruments like ERDF, Social Fund and Cohesion Fund, but not so much interlinked with the rural development activities. Right now in partnership contract, we have to look at the totality of investment as well incorporating the synergies between different funds, which we believe would be better added value for and greater value for money because we will be able to ensure and enhance more tailor-made and more specific allocation and as well avoiding some coordination errors as we've seen inevitably, and not only in Latvia but as well in other countries. In addition to that, we of course paying more attention to the indicators, and as Professor said, it's like a new buzzword as well from the Commission services side because it's not so much the issue in itself in creating new indicators of measurement, but it's the change of the policy. It's change from the policy from the transfer of funds or transfer of policy from richer countries to the less developed countries, but it's a change of policy in terms of creating that as an investment policy which allows countries to better explore the co-financing possibilities in various sectors. And in that sense, we clearly see that this is a joint learning process between the government services and the Commission services in creating this better mutual understanding in the way of measuring the quality of those investments. Because indeed, you are absolutely right in saying that this better spending policy is a very high policy priority defined for the MMF. Clearly, at the moment, we are trying to find the right solutions on the practical implementation. And perhaps what needs to be said in conclusion to this, yes, clearly all what Professor said is being the part and parcel of our everyday job in terms of preparing the programs. And what is important from national economy side is that we are not experiencing any major gap between the two financial perspectives. as the importance of these investments are of such significance. And therefore, from the government side, we are really earmarking the deadline for submission of the program drafts by mid-summer, basically. The 1st of June would be the deadline by which we assume to be able to conclude informal consultation process with the Commission services, and that would enable us as well to deal with the administrative and other sort of system improvement things during the next half year, and would allow us to start the new financial perspective as from the January next year, which is actually the optimum size in making sure that there is no investment gaps or basically there is a right bridging for the activities as the current financial perspective is in a way phasing out. But clearly that would be a great challenge for everyone involved, and I believe we'll be able to succeed that as well, matching the policy expectations from both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eberhardt, for letting us understand how this all looks from Riga, from a line ministry perspective. But how does it look from the private sector? Because all of these investments by the Commission clearly are meant to allow the private sector to develop, to allow the economy to develop. Mr. Strasts, you are a well-known economic commentator here in Latvia, work for a big bank. What do you say about all this?
Thank you, Labakar. I'm not a cohesion policy expert, so you can dismiss me right away on the grounds of that. I'm actually, neither am I a macroeconomist by training. That will surprise some of you. I'm a strategy guy by training, and actually the guy who taught strategy to me, or one of the key guys, he looked more like a rock star than a university professor. So that was Kjell Norrström in SSC in Stockholm. So that rounds off my profile simply for you, for some of you who don't know me that well. So let me give you a strategy framework, very basic framework how to think about strategy. So you can think about strategy in terms of a doctor's visit. If you are sick, you probably have some symptoms, say you have a running nose, a sore throat, whatever. Then the doctor should diagnose you with something. So that something might be, say, flu or whatever else there is. And then the doctor should have an idea of some sort of general approach how to treat you. So that could be, for example, if you have a smart doctor, that could be non-antibiotic treatment, so that you don't swallow a lot of antibiotics, but you do a lot of different things. And then, of course, it's the different steps of the different little things that you do. So that rounds off the whole framework. So I will address the cohesion thing from the perspective of that framework. And of course, I could pick here many things, but in terms of symptoms, I will, of course, pick the elephant in the room, which is the population loss in Latvia, but not only in Latvia, by the way, in many of the Central Eastern European countries. Actually, we just had a population census, so it turned out that within 10 or 11 years actually of time, we have lost about 12% of our population, slightly more than that. But actually, those censuses took place also all over Central and Eastern Europe, and we could see that Romania lost as much, Lithuania lost as much, Bulgaria lost somewhat less, Estonia lost a little, and then there were some countries that gained, actually very slightly, but a couple of percent. So those were Czech Republic and Slovenia. So then if we look at the Latvian data, what do we see? On average, we have this minus 12-something%. Actually, Riga and the greater Riga region, we have something like roughly minus 8% maybe, or roughly along those lines. Whereas in some other regions, and actually the further away from Riga, the higher the loss of population. So further away from Riga, you have maybe minus 17, minus 19%, even minus 20%. And then there is a third level, there is the regional level, and you see that in regions such as Vidzeme, for example, you have in Valmiera, say, minus 7%, but in the whole region you have minus 13%, something more like the national average. So you see stepwise this kind of interesting development, and that brings me to my diagnosis. I don't pretend to have the only correct diagnosis here, but if you do a simple linear correlation analysis, you actually see that in Central Eastern Europe, this population loss is very, very much proportional to the income gap between the given country and the EU 15 average. So countries which have the lowest income per capita, so the highest population gaps, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, so those are also the countries which are losing most population. Whereas Czech Republic and Slovenia, which are fairly close to EU 15 average already, so they don't lose population, actually they gain a little bit of population. And then if you look at Latvia, the breakdown for Latvia, you see again that the greater Riga region, so Riga plus the region adjacent to Riga, actually, of course, is about 2 times better off in terms of income per capita than the rest of the country. And that's very clearly correlating also with the population loss. And also in the, although there is no precise data, also in these other regions, you see that the key cities actually they lose less population, and I would suspect, although I don't have detailed data, I would suspect that the income per capita is much higher, say in Liepāja, than it is in some little village 40 kilometers out of Liepāja. So that actually brings me to the third step in my framework. So what's the approach? So what's the treatment? And actually that diagnosis gives you an idea of the potential treatment. And the treatment, well, if you want a higher income, so of course, but that's just a name. So what can you do? Well, you need to raise the productivity of the system or of the region or whatever you call it. Well, we can call it economic system, we can call it city, we can call it development point or whatever else there is in terms of terminology. So I think actually, so here I'm a bit, I will oppose a bit my colleagues. I think that there are too many goals actually in this national development plan. I think there should be one key goal, and that should be a productivity breakthrough, and that's it. Well, that's my personal opinion. You can have different opinions, but I think productivity breakthrough, and that's it. Because by otherwise we cannot stop losing population. And then, on top of that, of course, comes the concentration thing, which Professor also mentioned. And I think that there should be not 9 plus 21. I think that there should, well, I have to provoke a bit, so that's my job here. I think there should be only 9 and full stop. Why? Because those are the points in which we have actually some chances to raise the productivity enough to stop the population loss, to break the trend. Actually, what we have to do, we still keep bleeding population. We have to stop that. We cannot stop that in the country as a whole. That's just a task that even Valdis Dombrovskis cannot do. We have to focus, and of course we have to focus on Riga and the greater Riga region, and well, my suggestion is to focus on the 8 other key cities. And then of course it's the question of priorities, which were also nicely outlined there. So that's my final. I'm finishing. The question of priorities, and well, I see actually also too many priorities. Sorry to sound like an old professor, but there is, this saying that if you have too many priorities, that means that you have no priorities, and I think that's the problem with the National Development Plan. And if I look at this, CO2 and becoming more green and some other key initiatives there. Well, I don't think they address the problem. I don't think they address the problem that the productivity level is not high enough for us to stop bleeding population. And thus, I would actually delete some of those productivities. I think there, some of those priorities. I think there are some other key priorities like institutional capacity, like employment and mobility, like SME competitiveness, which should clearly be there. But I have doubts about some of the other priorities. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Mr. Strast. Before opening the floor for questions, Mr. Strast gave us a good view from the outside and also a very provocative view, but reminding us of the fact that all these funds are really meant to increase the welfare, the level of income of the people living in Latvia, and remind us about the main way of doing that. But maybe I'll give a chance for the other panelists to respond to this. How well do the cohesion funds fit with this kind of demand or this kind of goal or this kind of strategy that Mr. Strast has put forward, and how do the concrete Latvian government plans fit in with this? Perhaps we'll start with Professor Bachler.
Okay, thank you. I thought there were three very interesting commentaries. I have to say I like very much the analogy that Andrew Strast used at the start, and I think I might use that in future, about the medical analogy, because it actually gets to the heart of the fact that we're working with imperfect information, in the same way that if you go to see a doctor, often your doctor doesn't really know what's wrong with you. Based on what you're telling the doctor, he or she will make a best guess or best judgment. And we often in looking at regions or looking at countries, we have, either because of the problems of the data's out of date, or that it's not the right data, or the way you interpret it and analyze it, you really have an imperfect understanding of the needs and challenges. So you're making your best judgment on the basis of what's available. Secondly, there's the question of the options. Is it a hospital case, or is it will someone get better on their own? To what extent will intervention actually have desirable effects or undesirable effects or side effects? And we've all seen how there have been mistakes with interventions that have actually made a problem worse. And it's often only sometime later that you can actually see, oh right, that wasn't actually the problem. So I think that's a very good analogy in some respects, although you can take it too far. I think one of the problematic issues that we have in thinking about cohesion policy priorities in the next period is that the Commission's proposals come from a specific. They come from you have to see them in terms of the context, particularly the political context. That the cohesion policy as a budget has been as a share of the budget has been under enormous pressure, and if you go back to Tony Blair's speech to the European Parliament in July 2005. He said very clearly what a lot of people, particularly in net payer countries, but also in other parts of the Commission, think, that cohesion policy, as he described it, was an old policy, money being given for traditional purposes that wasn't forward-looking in terms of investing in growth and competitiveness of the European Union. And essentially the European Commission, first through DG Regio and then the Commission more generally, has taken the view that for cohesion policy to continue, particularly if it's to continue not just in the poorest countries and regions, but to continue being relevant to all countries, then it has to be a delivery vehicle, it has to be a delivery arm of wider EU objectives. So, the purpose of the proposals, and particularly the thematic concentration, is geared very much to what is it that the European Union as a whole requires in terms of the diagnosis that has been made in Brussels. Now, the question then is how do we apply that in individual countries? And if you've only got 11 priorities, it very much depends how you interpret those in individual national and regional context. Is what you want to do maximize growth, or do you want to maximize cohesion? Now, those two issues are not necessarily stand in opposition, but potentially, should we in a Latvian context be putting huge amounts of money outside Riga, particularly in those in those parts of the country where you've got depopulation, where you've got rising unemployment, where you've got particularly low GDP, or do you put it in the Nine, or particularly in Riga, where you get maybe the biggest return in terms of growth and competitiveness? I can say a bit more about the lessons that we've learned from Cohesion in a minute, but those are just some initial comments.
Okay, maybe just a few comments. First, I think it goes quite clearly with the new approach for the programming that we are trying to see through all the activities, through all the proposals from the line ministries, that the creation of jobs, creation of growth vehicles is the part of the overall investment policy as we are designing. However, we have to understand that not only from the government side, but as well from the Commission side, there are quite a number of players. And all of those players would like to see their own place, their own share of the investment policies. Because if there are no allocation for X policy, the question is whether that institution from other sides, whether that's an effective institution. And therefore, even though having a very nice and very prominent vision of thematic concentration and 11 priorities, we see sometimes quite an attempt to maintaining this Chinese menu element, that you are having bits and pieces of everything, trying to refocus, reshape, and putting in new cap. Well, whether that's something unique? No, I don't think so. I think that's the part that we are trying gradually to move, to concentrate the system, to really try to see where the investments are working more effectively and efficiently, and really perhaps putting the bigger share of monies into that areas. I'm not sure that it would be as simple as that we would cut off investments in certain policy areas per se. I don't think it would be ever possible. If you are looking as well from the Commission strategy paper, which has been presented and announced last year, and which is in a way a mirroring strategy document in comparison to the National Development Plan as a reference point for us in terms of preparing the programs, then we see as well quite a small sort of fragmented elements of various interests and various policies reflected into that. But it's not to say that there is a problem with one way or another. What I'm saying is that at the end of the day, we have to make rather hard policy choices, because if we are not allocating the investment resources to certain policy areas, most probably there will be rather little investment made because of this scarcity of resources. Of course, we can say that perhaps private investments could come in, and most probably in certain areas we see a fundamental need to increase a private investment share, specifically to achieve certain certain criteria or certain investment characteristics in comparison to the neighboring countries. And clearly there are areas where we would not be able to close those investment gaps just with the public monies. But once again, the point is that we have to make sure that we are gradually moving to this understanding, and that's a little bit time consuming. Thank you.
I will try to reflect very shortly. In some terms, economic breakthrough is possible only through the productivity. And I absolutely agree that productivity is basic mover of all priorities in national development plan. But I absolutely agree with what said Mr. Seberhardt, that we can't shift some priorities, not looking on a whole economic sector as a whole. We're talking about very much like a household where we need some solidarity with different people within in our household. And for example, if you're talking about healthcare sector, we on the developing of national development plan, developing of investment activities, we very much looked how this creates with this potential economic growth sector, how it creates with employment, where our employees have to be healthy, and it's one of the reasons why we can't very easy shift some sectors and said, okay, let's put money only on some very productive. I don't know whether it's grants for technologies or etc. Our basic challenge was to create public investments which are creating additional benefits for private sector and which are creating economic activity.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. And now we have about half an hour for questions and comments. And I see that in the first one is raising her hand, and I'll just so our
Well, actually, I do not have a lot of questions, but I have a couple of comments. Certainly, the budget for the next financial period suggested by the Council is not a dream budget of the European Commission, it's clear. And therefore, the problem is how to reallocate this budget in a best possible way. But the best possible way is not always the optimum. It's actually Pareto optimum, because there are a lot of negotiators inside the process, and I'm not going to even question why, for example, France and Spain, whatever, has a I don't know, better result as compared with previous budget. What is important for Latvia? Latvia remains the net receiver. So it's beneficiary of the budget. Yes, Latvia will, compared to the previous period, to get a little bit less, but still it's enough to have, I'm now referring to the Latvian governance estimates. Latvians will receive about 3,000 euro per capita in the next financial period, and this is the third best result among the European countries. Now, my question and my concern is how this money will be spent, because this is what you also made a certain emphasis on, and I'm deeply convinced that even with a relatively less amount of money, the country could do more if the money will be spent effectively. If we are talking about Latvia, I was trying to find information how the money has been spent in the previous period in terms of outcome, in terms of efficiency. And believe me, I have no information about it. I have just spending by sectors, by projects, by whatever, but not in terms of outcome and not in terms of efficiency. And I would like to say that whatever macroeconomic analysis has been done in the School of Economics, Stockholm School of Economics, you know, I'm also macroeconomist by training and by biggest part of my career, but this is not the analysis what we need in this particular case, because we need to estimate each particular project, what this project has been, what was the outcomes, in terms of efficiency of spending, and in terms of outcome for the region or for the country as a whole or for the sector. I mean, and unfortunately, this information is missing. Now, I would like also to comment a little bit on your productivity. First, I fully agree with Professor Butler, but also with the Commission, because this is a Commission approach, to have few projects, to how to say, to select the right but few priorities, to improve more flexibility of spending money and so on. But I disagree that it could be for Latvia just one priority, because even mathematically speaking, what does it mean, productivity? You can have less people and to increase your productivity very well. So, and for Latvia, what is crucial? It's competitiveness. It's competitiveness based on innovation and technology. Because without this, Latvia will not increase in productivity in an intelligent way, how to say. And second thing, we shouldn't forget about social fund. We shouldn't forget about inclusive growth. I mean, this is not just growth. It is growth for people. And people should increase their quality of life. Not just, I'm talking not only about eliminating poverty, fighting against poverty, fighting against unemployment, but the quality of life in terms of education of people, affordability and quality of education, affordability and quality of health services, in terms of their safety, in terms of pollution, or, I mean, of course, we can think, okay, for the next 7 years, perhaps the green economy is not that important as, for instance, inclusive for Latvia. But now Latvia actually has received from European Commission recommendation. And what is the goal for Latvia? To implement this, to implement and to report back to the Commission how the European funds, but also national budget, has been spent, and also private funds, how they have been spent in order to achieve, to improve the situation in accordance to these priorities. I perhaps should stop there because I would like to give the floor to the next speakers.
Ina raised a number of issues, but I think I'll ask for some other comments or questions, and then I'll hand them out to the head. If you could identify yourself.
Professor Ivars Kalviņš. I have one general question. It was probably initiated by Mr. Strasts. I did not hear about the diagnosis. Really, European community have lost the battle during the last period against China, against USA, against other Eastern countries in the economical growth and etc. What was the reason for such a result? There was no analysis. The second, what we should do really to improve the situation, because the depopulation for themselves is very dangerous, but much more dangerous is brain losses. And the brains are draining, they are going away, first of all from our region, then from Europe to United States, even to China, etc. How to stop this? And we have heard today, excuse me, today about the productivity. I doubt about this word can be used in Latvia as it is. Because in our society, the politicians think productivity is increase of the production, something. in the reality, this is not that. Because if you think so, and it is the last period for Latvia, very typical period, modernization brings increase of productivity, okay, and losses of employment, places, working places, losses, and you can continue modernization and increase of productivity only if you can sell it, what you produce. And then the question is, probably the main mistake for Latvia and for Europe is the modernization and not innovation. That means you have to produce innovative products with very, very high added value, and then it's not needed 10,000 or million of items to be sold, but only some, probably thousands, and you will get the same amount of money back in the industry. And then you have to speak about incomes, increase, etc., etc. If we simply will increase the productivity, nothing will be achieved.
Okay, we've had a lot of issues raised. I think I'll give some. First of all, I'll ask Professor Butler and Mr. Eberhards about this this issue about analyzing the previous periods' investments. First, Mr. Eberhards, how is Latvia doing with that? And perhaps Professor Butler could also talk about what the experience is in other countries about this kind of analysis. And then with regards to productivity, maybe Mr. Strass can expand on his ideas about this. Yes, okay, so.
Thank you. I think with this question we are coming very much to the essence of or rather sort of academic debate on aid opponents and aid proponents, basically saying whether aid works and whether aid is in a way transfer from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries, and clearly to measure that you have to have empiric data, empirical evidence, and most importantly, you have to have a clear criteria how to measure the efficiency of those investments. I wish we could turn back 7 years and with the design of programs clearly say, yes, by these investments, at the project level, there should have been certain indicators or measurements of achievements. Unfortunately, design of programs at this very stage would not allow us precisely to answer your questions at this very moment. However, for the future, and that is what the professor said, there is a strong emphasis to build in these measurement systems, the investment qualities measurements, into the new program design. As we go, we are trying to build these mechanisms, these new approaches. I hope that in 7 years from now, we'll be able to answer why, or even earlier, because there will be a midterm assessment for various activities, and we believe we'll be able to show that even at the not only macroeconomic but as well microeconomic level, there is a clear evidence of the achievements. However, there is another thing perhaps that needs to be mentioned and underlined, maybe to outline the context of the debate. There is another new element which hasn't been really mentioned so far, that the benchmark for assessment of various investments would be whether or not these investments in the future would contribute to so-called smart specialization strategy, which is a novelty, if you like. Before, we haven't had any sort of strategy for specialization or focusing investments. At the moment, our colleagues from the Ministry of Education, together with the Scholarly Society and as well Ministry of Economy, is defining those areas for interventions where we have competitive advantage in terms of academic potential, in terms of industrial demand side, where we would focus not through the whole spectrum of economy, but really to focus the investments in narrow areas. And I believe that by this additional element, we will be more successful in terms of focusing the scarce resources towards the productive investments. Thank you.
Mr. Butler, how have other countries done in terms of analyzing the efficiency of these cohesion funds?
Okay, I mean, just a couple of words on Latvia, looking from abroad. I mean, firstly, I mean, there are three ways you can look at it. One is spending the money, one is managing the money, and one is what you're achieving with the money. In terms of spending the money, Latvia is doing, the last time I looked at the figures, is doing reasonably well, is above the EU average. Especially for European Social Fund, is one of the highest, along with Estonia, I think, in the EU. There is a problem EU-wide of not spending enough money quickly in this period. There's a big chunk, I think maybe almost as much as half of the funding which has yet to be paid out under cohesion policy, which is a huge challenge, and particularly in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, but also in southern Italy, where it's catastrophic in terms of spending. So Latvia, certainly in this period, is not doing badly in an EU context. Secondly, in terms of management, we did some work in my institute looking at the period 2004 to 2008, and again, in an international context, Latvia managed the funding well in terms of complying with the processes of programming, of management, of financial management, and indeed the Central East European countries that joined in 2004 collectively did better on many measures, like decommitments and so on, irregularities, than the EU 15. In terms of outcomes, people here will know more than I, but I mean, from what I recall in evaluations, the European Social Fund has been particularly effective, I think, in terms of the lessons that one reads, in terms of investments in employment, in social inclusion. In enterprise investments, one of the criticisms has been that a lot of the money has gone into lower value sectors and activities. Infrastructure is mixed, good in terms of road transport, but less so in terms of energy. But the biggest problem that's constantly identified is in innovation. And there seems to be a bit of a gap between the ambitions in the National Development Plan from, I think, is it 0.6% at the moment of investment in R&D to, I think, maybe the objective of 1.6%. I can't recall the exact figures. There seems to be a gap between that and the performance in terms of actually spending money on science and R&D and so on. So, I mean, that's an issue. In terms of an international perspective, I mentioned earlier that my institute is doing a study for DG Regio, where we're looking at the lessons from the period from 1989 to the present in 15 case study regions of the EU 15. What is it that one can say about what cohesion policy has done and what the lessons are? And on the theme that we've been discussing, there are many, many lessons that are coming out, but on the issue of how one spends the money, one of the biggest lessons is the fragmentation of assistance, of spreading it out over too many projects, many of which are small projects, on too many different interventions, and in retrospect, a relatively small number of interventions have given the biggest return. And looking at the period from 1989 to the present, spending too much time on infrastructure and coming too late to innovation. Now, those are the general lessons. However, let me qualify that. Many of those smaller projects and interventions in infrastructure also have had a value, but in the longer term. Not necessarily the empty motorways in Greece and so on, but if I look at my own country, if I look at Scotland, they spent, in the rural areas of Scotland, they spent enormous amounts of money on relatively small projects, straightening roads, strengthening bridges, improving piers, giving money to communities to keep people there in the area, and so on. This probably wouldn't be possible now in the current period if we were starting again. Yet in retrospect, what that has done is create a basis for an increasingly vibrant tourist industry and for the exploitation of a whole variety of ICT-related activities. So I think one has to be careful about being too judgmental in terms of what the value is of some areas of investment where the returns are over the long term compared to ones which will give you more returns over the 7-year period, for instance.
Okay, thank you. Something about productivity?
Yeah, a few comments. First, I have actually to answer Professor's question on the diagnosis for Europe. Well, there is actually a diagnosis for Europe, or at least I pretend to have one. And it's approximately as follows. It's not true that all of Europe lost out to, say, China. There is a certain core in Europe, and that core is composed of Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, which actually didn't lose out and didn't even, if you look at the global market shares, global export market shares, for example, didn't lose out to China. So China's, of course, rise is in a way logical because it started from a very low level. But the trick was that some countries in Europe, they not only bought from China, but they managed also to sell quite a lot to China. And then there were other countries, not to be named, in order not to offend some people in the auditorium, which were not as successful. They bought from China, but they didn't sell anything in China or didn't sell much in China. So that was a problem. So where was the, well, EU 12 or the eastern part of the Europe in that whole thing? Well, it's quite well off actually as well, because it actually managed mostly to sneak into those global supply chains for Germany, for Austria, for Belgium, for other core countries, actually start supplying intermediate goods for in particular technology products and other things. So it's not all grim in Europe, but there is a certain part of Europe, yeah, which desperately needs some reforms. So then back to productivity and your question. Well, I think there will also kind of overlap because competitiveness and productivity. Well, they are quite terms that you can. There's maybe 80% overlap between those terms, and if you look at say global competitiveness report, so you also have competitiveness there, but you have also lots of talking about productivity and different aspects, institutional aspect, infrastructure aspect, etc., etc. Education was mentioned, very important aspect, etc. So I don't think that. So I was not thinking in the primitive. Just let me stress in the primitive manner of dividing the output by the number of people in the country. So that's not my understanding of productivity, even though I'm not macroeconomist by training. Yeah. Okay, but let me shut up by saying that, you know, there is this American, I guess, saying that camel is a horse that was designed by a committee, and in your terms, you like economic terms, so camel is Pareto efficient, but a horse isn't. But we actually need the horse.
Hello, I just wanted to ask something about the corruption. If there is any national plan for the fighting of the corruption in the next years, if the government ministry is thinking about, or is a problem what is not in the agenda, since the funds and of course the corruption is two topics. What in the every day, unfortunately, are overlapping. Just this, really a simple question.
Well, yes, in principle, there is a government plan for dealing with the anti-corruption issues, and this plan involves as well, among other things, the risk mitigation measures for the EU co-finance activities, not only for the cohesion policy, but as well for the agricultural things. And I think it's quite inevitable that it's not only in this part of the world, but elsewhere, where there is a where there are dealings with the public monies, there are corruption risks, and therefore, as well, the government and government agencies are taking care of that. If you are looking in overall terms, and Professor already has touched upon certain issues, then corruption is being qualified as one of the irregularities. So basically, if there are doubts about the corruption, we are seizing the co-financing, and basically recently we had taken a number of very strict measures against beneficiaries where there were some doubts about the corruption. Of course, it's very harsh, and beneficiaries are rather unhappy, but basically there is no tolerance on these issues. And of course, we are not in position to declare those expenditures to the Commission services as eligible. So therefore, basically, we are building in the mechanisms by which beneficiaries are very much themselves in interest of monitoring first and foremost themselves. And of course, then there are special services like as well elsewhere which are taking care of that. I wouldn't like to there go into the regional comparisons, but clearly hopefully we're not so far as in other member states, in other new member states, where the Commission, because of this reason, actually closed the programs for various times. I'm not saying that we are in an ideal situation. What I'm saying is that the government services are taking care of that, and in overall terms, the error level for Latvia is below tolerable risk level, which is below 2%. Yeah, not only for the corruption, but in overall irregularities per se, which is quite, as Professor said, in quite good in numeric terms. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much to our panel. I think it's been an interesting discussion. We've seen these and I understand, Nina, that now we can invite you to wine and some.
Yes, informal part of the discussion will start right now behind